the distress call that reached Earth's outer relay stations carried none of the formal diplomatic language that usually characterized a communication between the Galactic Concord and its member species. It was raw, desperate, and unmistakably genuine. "This is Fleet Coordinator Issa Marin of the Concord Defense Authority, broadcasting to all member species on all available frequencies. The Voraxi Swarm has broken through the Turnian line. 7 core worlds have fallen in the last standard month. Our combined fleets are being ground down faster than we can rebuild them. We are losing this war. We need every ship, every soldier, every resource any member species can spare, and we need it now." Admiral Rosalind Chen listened to the recording twice in the silence of Earth's Combined Defense Command, then looked around the table at the assembled representatives of humanity's Unified Defense Council, men and women, who had spent the better part of 2 decades navigating humanity's cautious, junior membership within the sprawling alliance of species known as the Galactic Concord. "How bad is it, really?" asked Councilwoman Amara Osei, breaking the heavy silence that had followed the recording. "Worse than the broadcast suggests," said General Marcus Webb, pulling up the latest intelligence summary humanity's small diplomatic mission to Concord Command had managed to compile. "The Voraxi Swarm isn't a conventional military force, it's closer to a biological weapons system, self-replicating bioship constructs that consume planetary resources to build more of themselves. Every world they take makes their fleet larger, and the Concord's remaining forces proportionally weaker. Best current estimate puts total Concord collapse within 8 to 14 months. If the current trajectory holds, and they're asking humanity for help," Osei said. "UES, a species that joined the Concord 11 years ago, still restricted to observer status in most military matters, with a fleet a fraction the size of any of the Concord's founding species. They're asking everyone for help," Webb said. "We're one voice among dozens answering this call. Realistically, whatever we send will be a rounding error against a war of this scale." Admiral Chen had remained quiet through the exchange, studying the tactical summary with the particular intensity of someone turning over a problem from an angle nobody else in the room had yet considered. "Then let's make sure whatever we send isn't measured by its size," she finally said. Humanity's contribution to the Concord's war effort had, until that point, been modest, by necessity rather than choice. 11 years of Concord membership had taught Earth's leadership a difficult lesson. Humanity's conventional military technology, however impressive by its own historical standards, remained meaningfully behind the capabilities of species who had been navigating interstellar civilization for centuries or millennia longer. Contributing a fleet to the Concord's war effort would mean contributing ships that, ship for ship, simply could not match the front-line vessels of more established member species. What humanity possessed instead, and had spent the better part of a decade quietly developing with almost no fanfare beyond a small circle of military and scientific leadership, was something considerably stranger. The Prometheus, a single experimental warship built not around conventional weapons and armor, but around a radical, largely untested application of adaptive nanotechnology originally developed for deep space hull repair. Dr. Priya Anand, the lead scientist behind the Prometheus project, had spent 9 years convinced that the technology she was developing represented something genuinely unprecedented, even as skeptical military planners repeatedly questioned whether a single experimental vessel, however sophisticated, could possibly justify its enormous development cost. The Prometheus isn't a warship in the way the Concord understands warships, Anand explained to the assembled council, called in specifically to make the case for what would become one of the most consequential decisions in humanity's brief history among the stars. Every other vessel in this war, on both sides, is built around fixed weapons systems and fixed defensive capabilities. The Prometheus is built around an adaptive nanite matrix that can reconfigure the ship's hull, weapons, and shielding in real time, in response to whatever specific threat it encounters. It doesn't need to outgun the Voraxi Swarm in a conventional sense. It needs to outadapt them, and adaptation is something a self-replicating biological threat, for all its terrifying scale, has never actually needed to develop sophisticated countermeasures against, because nothing anyone has ever fielded against it has been capable of doing it. You're proposing we send a single ship, however advanced, against a swarm that's already overwhelmed the combined fleets of a dozen established species, Webb said, skepticism evident in his voice. I'm proposing, Anand said, that we send the one thing in this entire war that the Voraxi Swarm has never had to develop a strategy against, because nothing like it has ever existed before. Every other conquered vessel fighting this war is a known quantity to an enemy that adapts and multiplies based on what it encounters. The Prometheus is not a known quantity. It's not even a knowable one, by conventional Voraxi biological targeting logic, because it changes what it is faster than anything organic can process and counter. Admiral Chen made the recommendation to the full Unified Defense Council that evening, and after 11 hours of intense, occasionally contentious debate, the Council authorized what would become one of the most closely watched military deployments in humanity's short history among the stars, sending a single experimental warship, crewed by a hand-picked team of 31 volunteers, into a war that every conventional military analysis suggested was already lost. The Prometheus, commanded by Captain Idris Osei, Councilwoman Amara Osei's own son, a decision that had drawn considerable private controversy within the Defense Council before his exceptional service record, ultimately settled the matter. Arrived at the fractured Turnian line 6 weeks after departing Earth, entering a battlespace unlike anything human military planners had ever needed to model, the Voraxi Swarm, as fleet coordinators Issa Marin's forces had described, in increasingly desperate briefings, did not fight as a conventional military force. It moved as a single, coordinated biological mass, millions of individual bioship constructs, each one capable of rapid self-replication using consumed planetary and stellar resources, adapting their collective tactics through some form of distributed, hive-like coordination that Concord xenobiologists had spent years failing to fully understand, let alone counter. Fleet Coordinator Marin, coordinating the remaining Concord defense from her flagship near the fracturing Turnian line, greeted the arrival of a single human vessel with barely concealed disbelief. "This is the entirety of humanity's contribution?" she asked, reviewing the Prometheus specifications with visible skepticism. "One ship, against a swarm that has already consumed 7 times its own mass in conquered worlds since this war began?" "Fleet Coordinator," Captain Osei replied, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had spent months training specifically for this moment, "I'd ask you to withhold judgment until you've seen what this one ship is capable of." The opportunity came 3 days later, when a Voraxi splinter formation, several thousand bioship constructs, still a fraction of the swarm's total strength but more than enough to overwhelm any conventional Concord defense force, several times the size of the Prometheus, broke from the main swarm body and began advancing on a heavily populated Concord world that Marin's remaining forces had no realistic capacity to defend. Captain Osei, Marin transmitted, her voice tight with the particular exhaustion of a commander who had watched this exact scenario play out disastrously many times before. "That formation will reach Keth Prime's orbital defenses within 6 hours. We cannot reinforce your position in time. If you engage alone, you will almost certainly be destroyed." "Understood, Fleet Coordinator," Osei replied, requesting permission to test a theory. What followed, over the next 4 hours, would become one of the most extensively studied engagements in the war's entire history. Not because of its scale, which was modest by the standards of a conflict that had already consumed dozens of worlds, but because of what it revealed about the fundamental vulnerability at the heart of the Voraxi Swarm's seemingly unstoppable strategy. The Prometheus adaptive nanite matrix, as Dr. Anand had theorized, proved capable of reconfiguring the ship's defensive and offensive capabilities faster than the Voraxi Swarm's biological targeting systems could process and adapt to in return. Where conventional Concord vessels presented a fixed, learnable target that Voraxi bioship constructs could coordinate against with increasing efficiency the longer an engagement continued. The Prometheus presented something the swarm's collective intelligence had never encountered, a threat that changed its fundamental nature every few minutes, faster than the swarm's own adaptive biology could keep pace with. By the time the Splinter Formation broke off its advance on Keth Prime, having sustained catastrophic and unprecedented losses against a single vessel a fraction its own size, Fleet Coordinator Marin found herself reviewing tactical data that suggested something no Concord military analyst had dared to hope for in months. A genuine, exploitable weakness in the Voraxi Swarm's core strategy. It's not that they can't adapt to the Prometheus, specifically. Dr. Anand explained, via long-range transmission to the assembled Concord High Command, 3 weeks later, as the Prometheus' early success had begun reshaping the war's broader strategic calculus. It's that their entire biological coordination system is built around processing and adapting to threats that remain consistent long enough to be learned and countered. A ship that fundamentally reconfigures itself faster than their adaptation cycle can complete isn't a threat they're failing to counter. It's a threat their entire strategic framework has no category for at all. The implications, once understood, transformed the remaining course of the war. Concord shipyards across a dozen member worlds began the difficult, urgent work of adapting their own vessels to incorporate versions of the nanite matrix technology Dr. Anand's team had spent years developing, sharing detailed technical specifications with a speed and openness that would have been unthinkable before the Voraxi Swarm's advance had brought the entire Concord to the brink of collapse. It took another 11 months of hard, costly fighting before the tide of the war fully turned. The Prometheus, single ship, however revolutionary, could not by itself defeat a threat that had already consumed dozens of worlds and multiplied into the trillions, but it provided something the Concord's combined forces had desperately lacked before its arrival. A genuine strategic answer to an enemy that had, until that point, seemed to have none. By the war's formal conclusion, with the Voraxi Swarm's remaining biomass contained and neutralized across a dozen reclaimed systems, Fleet Coordinator Issa Marin stood before the full assembly of the Galactic Concord to deliver a report that would reshape humanity's standing among its allies for generations to come. 11 years ago, this Concord admitted humanity as its newest and least established member. Marin told the assembled delegates. Many among us, myself included, privately doubted what a species so young could meaningfully contribute to an alliance built on centuries, even millennia, of accumulated experience. We were catastrophically wrong to doubt them. When this war reached its darkest hour, when every established power in this Concord had exhausted its conventional strategies against an enemy that seemed genuinely unstoppable, it was humanity's willingness to think differently, to build something no one else had thought to attempt, that gave this alliance the one advantage it needed to survive. Captain Idris Osei, addressing the crew of the Prometheus in the war's aftermath, aboard a vessel that had, against every reasonable expectation, survived a war that had claimed so much else, offered a simpler reflection than the Concord's formal proceedings. They called for help because they were losing, he told his crew. And when they looked around at who might answer, humanity was the newest, smallest voice in the room. I think that's exactly why it worked. Every other species in this fight had spent centuries, sometimes millennia, learning to fight wars a certain way, and that certainty became a weakness the moment they faced something that didn't play by the same rules. We didn't have centuries of certainty to unlearn. We just had a problem, and the willingness to try something nobody else had thought to attempt. Back on Earth, the war's conclusion marked a quiet but permanent shift in humanity's place among the stars. No longer the youngest, most cautious member of an ancient alliance, but a species that had proven, in the moment the entire galaxy needed it most, that innovation born of necessity could accomplish what even the oldest and most powerful civilizations, bound by the comfortable weight of their own long history, had found themselves unable to achieve, alone. The Prometheus itself was retired from active service 2 years later, its groundbreaking nanite technology folded into a new generation of Concord vessels, built by a dozen member species working in genuine, hard-won collaboration. Dr. Anand, once a scientist whose project had nearly been cancelled for lack of confidence in its potential, found herself appointed to lead a new joint research division. Spanning half a dozen Concord worlds, tasked with ensuring that the alliance would never again face a threat it had no strategic answer for. Fleet Coordinator Marin, in the years that followed, made a point of visiting Earth, personally, something no senior Concord official had ever done during humanity's first 11 years of quiet, cautious membership. She toured the shipyards where the Prometheus had first been built, met the families of the crew who had volunteered for a mission most military analysts had privately expected to end in destruction, and told anyone who would listen that the Alliance's survival had ultimately come down to a lesson older, more established civilizations had simply forgotten how to learn. That true strength wasn't always measured in the size of a fleet, or the age of a civilization, but in the willingness to try something no one else had thought to attempt, at the exact moment it mattered most, but its name endured, in the histories written by species, far older than humanity itself, as the answer to a single, desperate question. The galaxy had once cried out, into the dark, not how many ships it would take to win an unwinnable war, but how much difference a single, truly different one, could make.